What's going on, guys? OJ back here with another video today. We're here to talk about some of the worst wet blanket performances in recent UFC history. And when I mean wet blanket performances, it consists of one guy laying on top of the other guy, barely doing anything. Right? There seems to be a lot of that going on lately in the UFC. And quite frankly, what's appalling is the fact that a lot of fans seem to be championing this particular style. All right, I'm going to be going over some of the worst performances when it comes to wet blankets because there's no entertainment value in this. So, without wasting any more time, let's jump right into the video. Okay, starting off with number 10, I got Islam Makhachev versus Jack Della Maddalena. I mean, anyone who's been following my channel knew this fight was going to be on here. Now, compared to all of the other fights that I'm going to be talking about later, it's not that bad because Islam Makhachev beat JDM in every aspect of the game, even in the striking. He took out Jack's calves, and it really hindered JDM's movements throughout the entire fight. But when Islam Makhachev was on top, ugh, you know, it was 20 minutes of half guard camping. I know JDM did try to reverse positions and Islam Makhachev, stuffed them. But other than that, though, the only time Islam Makhachev really tried to go for anything was when he went for the Darce. And what do you know? JDM could defend the Darce. So it ended up being an absolute dog shit fight that ended UFC 322. And I'm not afraid to say it was a dog shit fight, all right? This wasn't the worst fight in history, I'll tell you that much. But this was a prime example of a wet blanket performance that ultimately ended a great pay-per-view, right? And it's kind of disappointing to see that, right? This is not to say, though, that Islam Makhachev is a boring fighter. Right? I've seen him run through the lightweight division. He is fun majority of the time. It's just in this particular instance, Islam Makhachev had a wet blanket performance to say the very least. Okay, now moving on though, we got Mateusz Gamrot versus RDA. This one was slightly worse than Islam Makhachev versus JDM in my opinion, because the only highlight from this fight was when Gamrot got kneed up the middle and got dropped. Outside of that though, Gamrot just took down RDA, uh, camped him out. He didn't really advance positions past the mount. Maybe he would have gone for some ground and pound, but not really. I can't recall. He'll occasionally hug him against the cage. Like, this is a prime example of a wet blanket performance. And I say this as someone who kind of enjoys Mateusz Gamrot. Mateusz Gamrot, however, in this fight, it was really bad. It was really bad. And I don't know. I can understand why you wouldn't like Mateusz Gamrot after this fight because this was one of the worst wet blanket performances I can recall from 2024. And I think the UFC punished him for this by giving him Dan Hooker right after beating RDA. Either way, though, yeah, this was not a great fight to say the least. All right, now up next, though, we got Belal Muhammad versus Stephen Thompson. Now, many people misconstrued Bilal Muhammad's fight style and that people automatically assume that he's a wet blanket. He's not as much of a wet blanket, typically. Right? Typically, Bilal Muhammad is a very low output striker who will secure the end of the rounds by trying to get a takedown. All right, that's typically how Bilal Muhammad fights. But against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, oh boy, 15 minutes of smudge grappling. I know Wonder Boy's hard to submit, but can you at least throw some ground and pound on Wonder Boy? Like, you know that he can't get up, right? That's not what Wonder Boy does. And Bilal Muhammad, as the prospect, just camped in Stephen Wonderboy's half guard for the majority of the fight. Occasionally, Wonderboy could get himself up to the fence, but he'd just get dragged down because Bilal Muhammad, disgustingly wet blanket performance over here. This was not a great performance to say the least. And honestly, this is what deterred me from being a Bilal Muhammad fan initially. I know he's had a couple of okay-ish fights since, and the JDM fight was fun to say the least. But yeah, the Wonder Boy fight, not so much. And I think this is why Bilal Muhammad, for the longest time, didn't get any respect as like a top contender in the welterweight division. All right, now moving on though, we got Khamzat Chimaev versus Dricus Du Plessis. All right, this is a very similar situation to what Islam Makhachev did to JDM, but this was arguably worse. This was 21 minutes of side control, less than 5% of the ground and pound strikes Khamzat Chimaev landed were anything significant. Like, the only time this fight was fun was when DDP kicked in his plot armor in the fifth round and nearly submitted Khamzat Chimaev. And I say nearly in air quotes, all right? Like, it wasn't close. But that's my point, though. Khamzat Chimaev just kind of laid on top of DDP's side control for like 20 minutes, like at least like 4 whole rounds. To say that fight was entertaining, you're just lying to yourself. Right? If I wanted to get crucifixed in side control, I would just go to Tuesday BJJ. Unfortunately, though, some fans for some reason enjoy this performance. Meanwhile, shitting on all the other fights that I'm going to get to later. But either way, though, this was not an entertaining performance for Khamzat Chimaev. Am I saying this is how typically Khamzat Chimaev fights? No. All right, Khamzat Chimaev did get Robert Whitaker out in the first round. The Usman fight was kind of mid, to be fair. But at the same time, though, oh, he broke his hand, I guess. And not, but then outside of that, when he was fighting at welterweight, a lot of his fights were very fun to say the least. So, this is not an indictment on Khamzat Chimaev in general, but to say this particular fight was entertaining, you're out of your damn mind. All right, now up next though, we got Kamaru Usman versus Joaquin Buckley. I didn't even finish this bullet point, but it was basically just 20 minutes of grinding against the cage. To be fair, Joaquin Buckley didn't really know what to do, but at the same time though, the only time that this fight was fun was in the fifth round when Joaquin Buckley started mounting some offense. Safe to say this was a classic snoozman performance where he just kind of laid on top of Joaquin Buckley for 4 rounds. I know he cut Joaquin Buckley's eye towards the end of the first, but outside of that, I don't recall any sort of significant strike Usman really landed. I don't recall a single time Usman really advanced position. He just kind of stayed in either mount, half guard. I forget the position. But he just kind of wet blanketed Joaquin Buckley for 4 rounds. And it was a very uneventful fight to say the least. All right. And that's typically a lot of Kamaru Usman's fights if you don't know how to wrestle up. All right. Even in the Leon fight, the second one, the rematch, like it was kind of similar where he just kind of wet blanketed Leon Edwards. And honestly, I was kind of happy that Kamaru Usman lost because for the longest time I was like, all right, you're just fighting the same guys over and over again. Half of your performance are wet blankets. I know he got knockouts over Gilbert Burns and Jorge Masvidal. I only consider Gilbert Burns one a great knockout. The Jorge Masvidal one, let's face it, like he shouldn't have got the title shot in the first place. And yeah, Kamaru Usman, that's kind of typically how he fights, right? When he's not fighting fucking washed up Jorge Masvidal and Gilbert Burns. But yeah, though, this was not a fun fight. If you're saying this is a fun fight, you're lying to yourself. I don't even know who would say that Kamaru Usman versus Joaquin Buckley was a fun fight. But fair enough. If you can somehow justify it, then by all means. But personally, I think this was a classic wet blanket performance. Moving on, though, we got Nurullo Aliev versus Joe Solecki. Now, Nurullo Aliev's fighting this weekend against Shamrock. And the thing I worry about is the fact that that fight will go very similar to Aliev versus Solecki. Because let me just say this, less than 10 significant strikes in 3 rounds when you're the guy holding top position. Barely did anything to Joe Solecki, let's be honest. You just kind of stayed in his guard. Now, fair enough, Joe Solecki was the one pulling guard, but at the same time, though, can you do a little bit more, please? You have 15 minutes. And overall, this was a terrible fight. And honestly, I'm surprised that the UFC has not cut him. I'm gonna suspect that Nurullo Aliev gets cut if he has a similar performance against Shamrock. Because let's be honest here, Nurullo Aliev's fights are not fun. Nurullo Aliev will just kind of smudge you against the canvas. He'll throw some ground and pound, but it's nothing significant. Right? Like Joe Solecki is a kind of chinny fighter. Right? He's kind of been known for that, and Aliev was nowhere near close to putting him away across 15 minutes. So yeah, Nurullo Aliev versus Joe Solecki, terrible fight, wet blanket as hell. And do not ever say that this was a fun fight, otherwise you are just blatantly lying. Okay, now moving on though, we got Muhammad Mokaev versus Alex Perez. This is where things get really bad, right? Now Muhammad Mokaev, I know he has gotten a lot better outside of the UFC. I know that at times he could get finishes, but let's be honest here, this fight really showed us why Muhammad Mokaev's never gonna get a title shot in the UFC. Like, Muhammad Mokaev was supposed to get this layup in Alex Perez. I know Perez is a top 10-ish contender, but he's been outdone by many fighters who have a very similar style to Muhammad Mokaev. But what did Muhammad Mokaev do in this situation? He barely did anything with his takedowns. He got the back for like 30 seconds before getting reversed. And overall, this was not a great fight, right? Muhammad Mokaev, when he could get dominant position, immediately got reversed because he doesn't know how to control it, right? He don't have the jiu-jitsu of like a Tatsuro Taira. Like, half the time also, he kind of just stayed on his knees because Alex Perez would sprawl very well, and Makhachev couldn't really wrestle up or chain wrestle anything together. And this ultimately concluded with a terrible fight, right? Keep in mind, this was Perez coming off a 2-year layoff. So I don't know how much value I could have really put into Muhammad Mokaev at the time. And honestly, I was kind of glad that he got cut from the UFC, especially after his follow-up performance with Manel Cap. And this is kind of why I hesitate to say, oh, we should re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. Again, I know he's been getting crazy finishes outside of the UFC, but what if he comes into the UFC? Like, what if he fights like Amir Albazi and does the same thing? Right? Which I can very much see that happening. Who would care at that point? So yeah, Muhammad Mokaev versus Alex Perez, one of the worst fights you can watch. And honestly, I think this is why Dana White is so reluctant to sign Muhammad Mokaev back into the UFC. Okay, now up next we got Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso 3. Now, I could have gone with a lot of Valentina Shevchenko fights. Hell, I could have gone with last week's fight between Shevchenko and Wei Li, but I consider Shevchenko versus Grasso 3 arguably worse. It was arguably worse. Now, at least in the Wei Li fight, you saw Shevchenko actually throw some damaging shots. I know in the first round, she kneed Wei Li to the body, and low key, I think that dropped Wei Li. But it was just the rest of the rounds that were incredibly uneventful because Shevchenko used her size to kind of smudge Wei Li up against the canvas. This was a very similar situation, albeit way worse, because there was no significant strike thrown across 5 rounds. Right? At best, you could see Alexa Grasso trying to work her guard game or pull a guillotine, But unfortunately, that shit don't work in championship level MMA. And Shevchenko uh, just stayed in her guard for 5 rounds, laying on top of her. Like, no, like, refusal to enter any sort of advantageous position, refusal to throw any sort of elbows or ground and pound strikes. I thought that this was arguably the worst Shevchenko performance she's had recently. And, if you have anything worse than Shevchenko versus Wei Li, like, that's automatic top three in my books. So, Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso 3 killed UFC Noche, killed the Sphere card. Honestly, the main event between O'Malley versus Merab wasn't that much better, but compared to this, Merab versus O'Malley 1 was one of the most entertaining fights I've ever seen. All right, now up next to go, we got Torrez Finney versus Robert Valentin. I mean, where do we start with this? Torrez Finney refused to hurt Robert Valentin. I mean, he took down Robert Valentin nonstop, but again, refused to advance position, throw damaging shots. He had 4 significant strikes across 3 rounds. He made Chimaev versus Dricus Duplessis look like a world beater in comparison. Like, I don't want to see Torres Finney fight ever again. And it's because of this fight he had with Robert Valentin. Please, UFC, just cut Torres Finney at this point. Like, was there a time that I really liked him? Yes. Alright, when he was on the Dana White's Contender Series, he was a fun personality. There's a whole story of how he won the Dana White's Contender Series twice, but still didn't get his contract. And then he finally got a finish on his third try, so the UFC brought him in. But then, in hindsight, White was correct into not recruiting Torres Finney in the first place. All right, I really don't believe that Torres Finney belongs in the UFC. And honestly, this was arguably the worst fight of 2025, if not for the number one spot. We got Jailton Almeida versus Alexander Volkov. Yeah, this is top 5 heavyweight MMA in the year of 2025. And let me just say this. Had Jailton Almeida even thought of throwing a significant strike on ground, I would not be giving this fight any sort of negativity whatsoever. But because Jailton Almeida made it a point to basically stare into Volkov's eyes, low key make gay porno with him at this point. Like, that's how I would describe this fight. Because he just held dominant position against Volkov for 15 minutes. He doesn't throw any ground and pound strikes. He doesn't go for any submissions. It was just 15 minutes of him laying on top of Alexander Volkov. And immediately after, whenever the referee would stand them back up, Jailton Almeida, look at him go for another double leg, sitting Volkov on his ass and refusing to throw any sort of significant ground and pound strike. Overall, this was the worst fight I could recall in 2025. A classic wet blanket performance to say the least. And honestly, this made me consider why I'm even making videos about the UFC in general because of fights like this. How you even consider this entertaining, I don't know. But if you are, again, quit lying to yourself. And at that point, you're just salty that your parlay hit. Like, I refuse to admit that anybody here enjoyed this fight to say the least. Alright, that's gonna be it for this video. If you guys want to see more videos like this, please make sure to like and subscribe so we can monetize this channel. Otherwise, though, leave a comment down below what video ideas you guys have for me so I can make them. And outside of that, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.